Maya Johnson stood perfectly still in the cold processing room on the orbital station, floating high above Earth, and her heart was beating fast, but she kept her face calm because she had learned long ago never to show fear or weakness to people who wanted to hurt her. The year was 2287, and humanity had finally spread across 3 different star systems, with massive ships traveling between planets and stations, orbiting around distant suns. But even with all this progress and all this technology, some things never seemed to change, and Maya was about to learn this lesson in the hardest way possible. The recruitment officer sitting behind the desk was a pale man with cold eyes, and his name tag read Officer Greg Martinez. He looked at Maya with an expression she had seen before on too many faces throughout her life, and it was a look that said she did not belong here and never would. He gestured lazily toward a chair in the middle of the room and told her to sit down because it was time for her mandatory head shave. Maya walked to the chair and sat down without saying a word, because she knew that speaking up would only make things worse. She had dreamed about joining the United Earth Space Force since she was a little girl growing up in the lower sectors of New Detroit. She had studied hard and trained harder and passed every test they threw at her. Now she was finally here, and nothing was going to stop her from achieving her dream. Not even the look in Officer Martinez's eyes. Officer Martinez picked up the electric clippers and turned them on. The buzzing sound filled the room, and Maya closed her eyes for just a moment. Her hair was beautiful and thick, and she had worn it in intricate braids that her grandmother had taught her how to make. Each braid was a connection to her heritage and her family and her history. But military regulations required all new recruits to have their heads shaved, and Maya had accepted this. What she had not expected was what happened next. The door opened and 2 more officers walked into the room. One was named Officer Kyle Bennett, and the other was Officer Danny Cooper, according to their name tags. They both looked at Maya, and then at each other, and then they smiled in a way that made Maya's stomach tighten with anxiety. Officer Bennett leaned against the wall and crossed his arms and said, "Well, look what we have here. Another one who thinks she can make it in deep space combat." Officer Cooper laughed and said, "Yeah, this should be interesting. Look at all that hair. Gonna take forever to shave that mess off. Maybe we should just get a plasma cutter and be done with it." Maya kept her eyes forward and her jaw tight. She had dealt with bullies and racists before. Growing up in the lower sectors had taught her how to survive and how to endure. But she had hoped that the Space Force would be different. She had hoped that an organization dedicated to protecting all of humanity would judge people by their skills and courage rather than the color of their skin. She was learning now that hope was not always enough. Officer Martinez started running the clippers across Maya's scalp, but he was not gentle or careful like he should have. Then he pressed the clippers hard against her skin and moved them roughly, and Maya could feel small cuts forming where the blades scraped too hard. Officer Bennett pushed off from the wall and walked closer, and asked Maya if she knew what the survival rate was for people like her in space combat. He said that last time he checked, most of them did not even make it through basic training. Officer Cooper nodded and added that space does not care about diversity quotas or hurt feelings. He said space will kill you just as fast as it kills anyone else, and maybe even faster if you are not tough enough. Maya wanted to scream at them. She wanted to tell them that she had scored in the top 5% on every single entrance exam. She wanted to remind them that her physical fitness scores were higher than 70% of male recruits. She wanted to demand respect for her accomplishments and her dedication. But she said nothing because she knew that any response would be used against her. They wanted her to react. They wanted her to cry or yell or quit. And she would not give them that satisfaction. Officer Martinez spun the chair around suddenly, and more of Maya's beautiful braids fell to the floor. The other officers kept talking, and their words were like knives cutting into her spirit. They made jokes about her appearance and her background. They questioned whether someone from the lower sectors could really handle the discipline of military life. They suggested that maybe she should consider a different career path like food service or station maintenance. Each word was carefully chosen to humiliate and belittle her. The shaving continued, and Officer Martinez was deliberately careless. Maya could feel blood trickling down the back of her neck from where the clippers had cut too deep. She could see chunks of her hair scattered all around the chair on the white floor. Her grandmother had spent hours teaching her how to braid her hair in the traditional patterns. Those braids had been a source of pride and connection. Now they were gone, and these three men were laughing about it. Officer Danny Cooper made a comment about how Maya probably could not handle the cold of space stations or the heat of engine rooms. Officer Kyle Bennett said that emotional weakness was the biggest problem with recruits like her. Officer Greg Martinez just kept cutting and pressing too hard and smirking the entire time. The buzzing of the clippers seemed to get louder and louder until it filled Maya's entire head. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Officer Martinez turned off the clippers. He spun the chair around to face a mirror on the wall, and Maya barely recognized herself. Her scalp was visible and pale brown and covered with small cuts that were still bleeding slightly. Her beautiful braids were gone. Her connection to her grandmother and her heritage was lying in pieces on the floor. The woman looking back at her from the mirror looked vulnerable and hurt and beaten. Officer Martinez brushed some loose hair off Maya's shoulders and told her, "There you go, recruit. Welcome to the Space Force. Try not to wash out, too, in the first week." All three officers laughed as they walked toward the door. Officer Bennett called back over his shoulder and said he would bet money that she did not last a month. Officer Cooper agreed and said training was going to eat her alive. Maya sat alone in the chair staring at her reflection. Tears were forming in her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. She would not give them that victory. Instead, she touched her bare scalp gently and felt the unfamiliar smoothness and the small cuts that stung under her fingers. She made herself a promise in that moment, a promise that would shape the next 10 years of her life. She whispered to her reflection so quietly that no one else could possibly hear. "I will remember this, every single word, every single moment, and one day I will make sure you pay for it." Basic training at the Lunar Combat Academy was harder than anything Maya had ever experienced in her entire life. The academy was built into the side of a massive crater on the moon's surface, and every day brought new challenges that pushed recruits to their absolute limits. Maya woke up at 4 in the morning when the lights automatically turned on in the barracks. She had exactly 10 minutes to get dressed and get to the training yard. Then the real work began. The physical training was brutal and relentless. Maya and the other recruits spent hours every day running obstacle courses, while wearing heavy pressure suits that weighed more than 60 pounds. They practiced zero-gravity combat in special training modules where up and down stopped having any meaning. They learned how to survive in the vacuum of space and how to repair damaged equipment while floating outside a ship. They studied tactics and weapons and ship operations until their brains felt like they would explode. And through it all, Officer Greg Martinez was there watching and waiting for Maya to fail. Officer Martinez had been assigned as one of the primary training instructors, and Maya quickly realized this was not a coincidence. He seemed to take personal pleasure in making her life as difficult as possible. During morning exercises, he would stand right next to Maya and criticize every movement she made. He told her she was too slow and too weak and too soft for military service. When she completed an obstacle course faster than other recruits, he claimed she must have cheated somehow. When she scored high on written tests, he suggested she had copied from someone else. But the worst incidents were the ones that put Maya's life in actual danger. During a training exercise in the lunar canyons, all the recruits were given pressure suits and oxygen tanks for a 10-mile march across rough terrain. Maya checked her equipment 3 times just like she had been taught. Everything seemed fine when they started out. But after about an hour into the march, Maya's oxygen gauge started flickering and showing strange readings. The numbers jumped around wildly, going from 70% to 40% to 90% in just seconds. Maya knew something was wrong, but she also knew that complaining would only prove Officer Martinez right. He was always saying that recruits like her looked for excuses when things got hard. So Maya kept marching, even as her oxygen gauge became more and more erratic. She kept going even when her vision started to blur at the edges. She kept pushing forward even when her lungs began to burn. She finished the exercise dead last and barely conscious. When she finally crossed the finish line, Officer Martinez was waiting with that familiar, cruel smile. He told Maya that her performance was disappointing and pathetic. He said maybe she should consider a transfer to food service where the work was easier and the expectations were lower. Maya wanted to tell him about the oxygen gauge and the equipment malfunction, but she knew he would just say she was making excuses or that she was too incompetent to read a simple gauge properly. So she said nothing and added this incident to her growing mental file of evidence. That night in the barracks, Maya pulled out her personal data pad and began typing. She recorded everything that had happened during the exercise. She noted the time and the location and the specific readings on her oxygen gauge. She described Officer Martinez's behavior and his comments. She was building a case, but not for now. She was building a case for someday when she would have the power and the position to make people listen. Her bunkmate was a woman named Lisa Chen, who had come from the Mars colonies. Lisa was smart and observant, and she had noticed what Maya was doing late at night when everyone else was asleep. One evening, Lisa sat down next to Maya and asked quietly what she was working on. Maya hesitated for a moment, but then decided to trust her. She explained that she was documenting everything because she believed Officer Martinez was deliberately targeting her and other recruits. Lisa nodded slowly and said she had noticed the same patterns. She told Maya that Officer Martinez seemed to focus his cruelty on anyone who was not white or male. Lisa herself had experienced some of this treatment, though not as severely as Maya. She asked Maya what good documentation would do if the entire system was designed to protect officers like Martinez. Maya looked at her and said she did not know if it would work, but she knew that doing nothing was not an option. She said that maybe someday she would be in a position where her voice mattered. And when that day came, she wanted to have evidence. The weeks turned into months, and basic training continued to grind away at all the recruits. Some people quit and went home. Others were dismissed for poor performance. But Maya kept going and kept getting stronger. She learned to anticipate Officer Martinez's tricks. She checked her equipment 5 times instead of 3. She volunteered for the hardest assignments because she knew he would give them to her. Anyway, she studied twice as long as other recruits to make sure her test scores were beyond question, and something interesting began to happen. Maya started excelling in ways that surprised even her instructors. During tactical simulations, she demonstrated an unusual ability to think several steps ahead. She could see patterns in enemy movements that other recruits missed. She understood how to use limited resources in creative ways. During one particularly complex space combat simulation, Maya outmaneuvered every other cadet, including several who had graduated from expensive military prep schools. This caught the attention of Commander Patricia Hayes. Commander Hayes was one of only a handful of black women in senior leadership positions in the Space Force. She had been watching Maya's progress with interest. One day after the combat simulation, Commander Hayes asked Maya to stay behind for a moment. The other recruits filed out of the training room, and Maya stood at attention, wondering if she was about to be punished for something. But Commander Hayes did not look angry. Instead, she looked impressed. She told Maya that she had been observing her performance for several weeks. She said Maya had something special and rare, a mind that could see connections and possibilities that others missed. Commander Hayes said she knew about Officer Martinez and his behavior. She said she was sorry that Maya had to deal with such treatment, but she also said that enduring it was making Maya stronger. Then Commander Hayes gave Maya some advice that would stay with her forever. She said the best revenge is not anger or violence. The best revenge is success. She told Maya to keep her head down and keep working hard. She said to document everything, but not to let the desire for revenge consume her. And she said that one day when Maya had risen high enough, she would have the opportunity to fix the system from within. Maya thanked Commander Hayes and asked her how she had survived in an organization that seemed designed to push people like them out. Commander Hayes smiled sadly and said she survived by being better than everyone else. She said she had to work twice as hard as her male colleagues to get half the recognition. She said she had faced discrimination and harassment throughout her entire career, but she had endured and she had risen, and now she was in a position to help younger officers like Maya. After that conversation, Maya felt different. She realized she was not alone in this fight. There were others who had faced the same struggles and survived, and if they could do it, then so could she. She went back to her documentation with renewed purpose. She started paying attention to patterns not just in Officer Martinez's behavior, but in the entire system. She noticed how complaints disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. She saw how junior officers who reported misconduct often found their careers stalled. She understood that changing the system would require more than just evidence. It would require power and strategy and patience. By the end of basic training, Maya had transformed herself completely. The scared recruit who had her head shaved while officers mocked her was gone. In her place was a warrior with a sharp mind and an unbreakable will. Maya graduated in the top 10% of her class, despite all the obstacles Officer Martinez had thrown in her path. She received commendations for tactical thinking and leadership. And she carried with her a growing file of documented evidence against the officers who had tried to break her. As Maya prepared to move on to her first real assignment, she made a vow to herself. She would not just survive in the Space Force. She would excel. She would rise through the ranks, and one day when she had the power and the authority, she would make sure that people like Officer Greg Martinez could never hurt another recruit again. 5 years had passed since that terrible day in the processing center, and Maya Johnson had become someone completely different from the scared recruit who sat in that chair. She was now Lieutenant Maya Johnson, and she had earned her rank through blood and sweat and countless hours of hard work. She served on a destroyer-class starship called the UES Horizon, which patrolled the dangerous frontier zones where human space met the territory of alien species. Space was vast and full of threats, and Maya had learned to face them all with courage and intelligence. The defining moment of Maya's early career came during what became known as the Battle of Kepler Station. The station was a massive orbital platform that housed more than 3,000 civilians who worked in mining and research. It was supposed to be safe and protected, but intelligence had failed, and a hostile alien fleet appeared without warning. The Horizon was the only military vessel close enough to respond, and they arrived to find the station under heavy attack. The battle was chaos from the first moment. Enemy ships were fast and aggressive, and they had more firepower than anyone expected. The Horizon's captain ordered defensive positions, but within minutes the ship's tactical officer was killed when an explosion ripped through the bridge. Maya had been working at a secondary station, but she immediately jumped into the vacant position without waiting for orders. She had studied tactical operations for years and trained on simulators countless times. Now all that knowledge would be tested in real combat. Maya's fingers flew across the tactical console as she analyzed enemy positions and weapon ranges. She saw patterns in their attack formation that others might have missed. She realized the enemy was trying to draw the Horizon away from the station so they could board it and take hostages. If that happened, thousands of civilians would die or worse. Maya quickly developed a defensive strategy that kept the Horizon between the station and the enemy, while maximizing their own weapon effectiveness. For 3 hours, the battle raged in the darkness of space. Maya coordinated defensive fire and shield adjustments and ship positioning. She anticipated enemy movements and found weaknesses in their formations. She made split-second decisions that saved lives. When enemy reinforcements arrived, Maya adapted her strategy immediately. She ordered the Horizon to move in ways that seemed reckless but actually created perfect firing solutions. By the time Allied ships finally arrived to help, the enemy fleet was retreating, and Kepler Station was saved. The captain of the Horizon personally recommended Maya for promotion and for a commendation for valor. In his report, he wrote that Lieutenant Johnson's tactical brilliance and quick thinking had saved not only the station, but also the Horizon itself. Maya received her promotion to senior lieutenant and was accepted into the prestigious War College on Europa, which was one of Jupiter's moons. This was where the Space Force sent its best and brightest officers to learn advanced strategy and leadership. War College was different from basic training. In every way, the physical challenges were replaced by intellectual ones. Maya spent her days studying military history and analyzing famous battles from Earth's past and from humanity's conflicts with alien species. She learned about great commanders and their strategies. She studied the laws that governed military conduct and the complicated politics of interstellar relations, and she absorbed it all like a sponge, desperate for knowledge. One of her instructors was Captain John Blake, who taught advanced military law. Captain Blake was a stern man, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people. He noticed that Maya approached legal studies with unusual intensity. She did not just memorize the laws like other students. She understood them deeply and could apply them to complex situations. After class one day, Captain Blake asked Maya to stay behind. He told Maya that she studied military law like she was preparing for war. Maya looked at him calmly and said that all knowledge is a weapon if you know how to use it. Captain Blake studied her face for a long moment and then nodded slowly. He said that was true, but warned her to use her knowledge wisely. Maya thanked him for his concern and left his office. She knew what she was doing. She was building an arsenal of legal knowledge that would one day help her take down corrupt officers. During her time at War College, Maya also kept track of the officers who had tormented her. She had built a network of contacts throughout the Space Force. Other officers who had faced discrimination stayed in touch with her. They shared information and supported each other. Through this network, Maya learned that Officer Greg Martinez had been promoted to captain and given command of a training facility on Titan, which was Saturn's largest moon. Officer Kyle Bennett was now a commander running a supply depot. Officer Danny Cooper had become a lieutenant commander in the recruitment division TAO. 3 men had continued their patterns of abuse and discrimination. Maya heard stories from new recruits who had suffered under their command. There were whispered complaints and quiet allegations, but nothing ever seemed to stick. The system protected these men. They had connections and friends in high places. Officers who reported misconduct often found their careers mysteriously stalled. Complaints disappeared into administrative black holes. The old network of corrupt officers took care of its own, but Maya was patient. She knew her time would come. She kept adding to her files. She documented every new incident she heard about. She gathered witness statements and equipment logs and performance reviews. She was building a case that would be impossible to ignore. A case so comprehensive and so well documented that even the most corrupt officials would not be able to dismiss it. When Maya graduated from War College, she did so at the top of her class. She was offered several prestigious assignments, including positions on frontline battlecruisers and comfortable jobs at headquarters on Earth. But Maya chose something that surprised everyone. She requested assignment to the Judge Advocate General's Corps, which was the military's legal division. She wanted to become a prosecutor. Admiral Susan Parker, who oversaw personnel assignments, called Maya in for a meeting. The admiral was a tough woman who had earned her rank through decades of excellent service. She looked at Maya's request and asked why someone with such exceptional tactical skills would want to become a lawyer. Maya could have commanded a fleet someday. She could have been one of the Space Force's greatest combat officers. Why waste that potential on legal work? Maya chose her words carefully. She told Admiral Parker that she believed the Space Force needed officers who could fight battles both in space and in courtrooms. She said too many good people were driven out of service by corrupt officers who abused their power. She said the laws that protected service members meant nothing if they were not enforced. She wanted to be someone who enforced those laws. Admiral Parker listened carefully and then nodded. She said she understood and approved the assignment. She told Maya that the JAG Corps was lucky to have her. For the next 3 years, Maya served as a military prosecutor. She took on cases involving everything from theft to assault to corruption. She won most of her cases because she prepared more thoroughly than any other lawyer. She interviewed witnesses carefully. She analyzed evidence from every angle. She anticipated defense strategies and prepared counter-arguments. She became known as someone who never gave up and never backed down. Maya also earned a reputation for fairness. She did not prosecute innocent people just to get convictions. If she found evidence that suggested someone was not guilty, she shared it with the defense. She believed in justice, not just in winning. This made her respected by both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Even officers who lost cases against her admitted that she had been fair. But through all of this, Maya never forgot her true purpose. Every case she won taught her something new about military law and legal procedure. Every trial made her a better lawyer and a more formidable opponent. She was sharpening herself into a weapon. And all the while, her files on Captain Greg Martinez and his associates kept growing thicker. Then one day, the opportunity Maya had been waiting for finally arrived. Her assistant Lieutenant Kevin Morris brought her a stack of case files. Among them was a report about complaints filed against a training facility on Titan. Maya's heart beat faster as she read through the details. Multiple recruits had reported discrimination and harassment. There were allegations of abuse and dangerous training practices, and the officer in charge of the facility was Captain Greg Martinez. Maya sat at her desk, staring at the file. 10 years had passed since he shaved her head while mocking her. 10 years of hard work and preparation. 10 years of building evidence and gaining the skills she needed. And now finally the universe had given her exactly what she needed, the chance to bring Captain Martinez to justice. Maya held the file about the Titan training facility complaints in her hands and felt something she had not felt in years. It was not anger exactly, and it was not excitement. It was more like a sense of purpose crystallizing into perfect clarity. She had been preparing for this moment for 10 years, and now it had finally arrived. But she also knew she could not rush. One mistake and Captain Martinez would slip through her fingers, just like he had slipped through the system for his entire career. She called Lieutenant Kevin Morris into her office and closed the door. Kevin was a smart young officer who had become her most trusted assistant. He understood how to research thoroughly and how to keep secrets when necessary. Maya told Kevin that she needed him to do something important and potentially dangerous. She needed him to pull the complete service records for Captain Greg Martinez and also for Commander Kyle Bennett and Lieutenant Commander Danny Cooper. She wanted every assignment and every evaluation and every complaint filed against them or by them over their entire careers. Kevin looked at the names and then looked at Maya with understanding in his eyes. He asked if this was about what happened to her during recruitment. Maya was surprised because she had never told Kevin that story. But Kevin said he had heard rumors. Other officers talked quietly about Commander Johnson and how she had faced terrible treatment but had risen above it. They said she was someone who never forgot and never forgave when it came to injustice. Kevin said he would get the records she needed, and he would keep the investigation completely confidential. Over the next 3 months, Maya worked on building her case with obsessive attention to detail. She started by reviewing all the recent complaints from the Titan facility. There were 17 formal complaints filed in just the past 2 years. Recruits reported being given dangerous equipment. They described verbal abuse and discriminatory treatment. Several recruits who filed complaints mysteriously failed their training even though their performance had been excellent before they spoke up. But Maya knew that recent complaints alone would not be enough. She needed to show this was a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. So she began digging through the historical records Kevin had gathered, and what she found was shocking. Captain Martinez had been the subject of complaints at every single facility where he had served. The details varied, but the pattern was always the same. He targeted recruits based on their race or gender or background. He created hostile environments, and somehow he always avoided serious consequences. Maya discovered that complaints against Martinez often disappeared from official records. Sometimes they were labeled as resolved, when nothing had actually been done. Other times they were classified as personality conflicts rather than misconduct. And frequently the recruits who complained found themselves transferred to different units or even drummed out of service on fabricated charges. The system was not just failing to stop Martinez. The system was actively protecting him as Maya dug deeper. She found connections between Martinez and other officers. Kyle Bennett had served with Martinez at 3 different facilities. Danny Cooper had worked in recruitment offices that fed recruits to Martinez's training programs. There were other officers too, a whole network of people who protected each other and covered up each other's misdeeds. They represented everything wrong with the military system. But Maya needed more than documents and complaint forms. She needed witnesses who would testify. So she began reaching out to former recruits who had filed complaints against Martinez. This was delicate work because many of these people had left the military traumatized and angry. They did not trust the system anymore, and they were reluctant to relive painful memories. Maya had to convince them that this time would be different. This time someone with power was listening. She found a former recruit named Corporal Jake Rodriguez, who had been told he was not tough enough because of his heritage. He had washed out of training even though his scores were excellent. When Maya interviewed him over a secure video connection, Jake was hesitant at first. He said he had tried to report Martinez years ago and nothing happened. Why would now be any different? Maya looked directly into the camera and told Jake that she had personally been victimized by Martinez. She told him about the head-shaving incident and the mockery and the years of discrimination she had faced. She said she was now in a position to do something about it, but she needed brave people willing to speak truth to power. Jake thought about it for several days and then agreed to testify. He said if there was even a small chance of stopping Martinez from hurting more people, it was worth the risk. Through Jake, Maya found other witnesses. There was Private Angela White, who had faced sexual harassment disguised as training. There was recruit Marcus Freeman, who had nearly died when his spacesuit malfunctioned during a training exercise. Each person had their own story, but together their stories formed a devastating picture of systematic abuse. The breakthrough in Maya's investigation came from an unexpected source. She received an anonymous encrypted message from someone who identified themselves only as a concerned officer. The message said that if Commander Johnson was serious about bringing Captain Martinez to justice, then she should know that someone else had been documenting his crimes. The message included contact information for Staff Sergeant Linda Powell, who currently served at the Titan facility. Maya contacted Sergeant Powell immediately. Linda was a 20-year veteran with gray in her hair and a look in her eyes that spoke of too many battles. She told Maya that she had been keeping records for 2 years because she could not stand by and watch Martinez destroy good people anymore. Linda had videos and audio recordings and witness statements. She had equipment logs showing tampering. She had medical reports documenting injuries from training accidents that should never have happened. Linda said she had tried to report everything through proper channels. She had filed complaints with the Inspector General's office. She had spoken to senior officers at Fleet Command, but nothing ever happened. She was told she was being oversensitive. She was told that she did not understand modern training methods. One superior officer even suggested that maybe she was too old to understand how things work now. So Linda had kept gathering evidence and hoping that someday someone would care enough to do something. Maya spent an entire night reviewing everything. Linda sent her the evidence was incredible. There were recordings of Martinez making openly racist comments during training sessions. There were videos showing him deliberately giving wrong instructions to recruits and then punishing them for following his instructions. There were equipment logs proving that he had accessed training gear before it mysteriously malfunctioned. This was exactly what Maya needed, but she knew she had to be strategic about how she presented her case if she revealed her personal history with Martinez too early. The defense would claim this was just a vendetta. If she moved too fast, the network protecting Martinez would have time to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. Maya needed to build such an overwhelming case that no amount of corruption could deflect it. She needed to present it at exactly the right moment, to exactly the right people. Maya began drafting a comprehensive report to the Judge Advocate General. She outlined not just the recent complaints, but the entire pattern of behavior spanning more than a decade. She detailed how the system had failed repeatedly to address the problem. She showed connections between multiple officers who seemed to protect each other. And she recommended that due to the seriousness of the allegations and the potential for conflicts of interest, the case should be handled by a special court-martial with independent oversight. Kevin helped Maya organize hundreds of pages of evidence. Into a clear narrative, they created timelines showing patterns of behavior. They prepared witness lists and evidence inventories. They anticipated every possible defense argument and prepared counter-arguments. This was not just a case. This was a comprehensive indictment of systematic corruption. Before submitting her report, Maya met with Commander Patricia Hayes, who had retired but still maintained influence within the Space Force. Patricia read through Maya's case file carefully. When she finished, she looked up at Maya with something like pride in her eyes. She said this was the most thorough case she had ever seen. She said Maya had done what Patricia herself had never quite managed. She had built something that could not be ignored or buried. Patricia warned Maya that there would be consequences. The network that protected Martinez would fight back. They would try to discredit Maya and intimidate her witnesses. They would claim this was political correctness, run amok, or a personal vendetta or an attack on military tradition. Maya would face pressure from people who outranked her. She might even find her own career in jeopardy. Patricia asked if Maya was prepared for all of that. Maya thought about the scared recruit sitting in that chair 10 years ago. She thought about all the witnesses who had trusted her with their painful stories. She thought about future recruits who would face Martinez's cruelty if nothing changed. Then she looked at Patricia and said yes. She was prepared. She had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Whatever consequences came, she would face them, because this was bigger than her career. Maya walked into the Judge Advocate General's office with her heart pounding, but her face showing nothing but professional calm. The JAG was Admiral Christopher Wright, and he was known as a tough but fair officer who took his responsibilities seriously. His office was lined with books about military law and history. He gestured for Maya to sit down and then spent several long minutes reading through documents on his desk without saying a word. Maya sat perfectly still and waited. Finally, Admiral Wright looked up at her and said that her report was remarkable. He said in his 30 years of service he had never seen such thorough documentation of misconduct. He had spent the last 3 weeks personally verifying her evidence and interviewing key witnesses. Everything she claimed appeared to be true. Captain Martinez and his associates had indeed engaged in systematic discrimination and abuse. The question now was what to do about it. Admiral Wright explained that prosecuting a case like this would be complicated and controversial. Captain Martinez had friends in high places. The officers who had protected him for years would fight to protect him again. There would be claims of political motivation and attacks on military tradition. The case would attract media attention and public scrutiny. It could turn into a circus if not handled properly. He asked Maya if she understood all of this and if she was still willing to take on the prosecution. Maya looked Admiral Wright directly in the eyes and said yes. She understood the risks and she was prepared for them. She had been preparing for 10 years. She told him that this was not about revenge or politics. It was about holding officers accountable when they violated their oaths. It was about protecting future generations of recruits from suffering what she and so many others had suffered. It was about proving that the system could work if good people were willing to fight for justice. Admiral Wright nodded slowly and said he believed her. He told Maya that her request to lead the prosecution was approved. The case would be tried by a special court-martial panel to ensure fairness. He was assigning her 3 months to prepare. He warned her that the defense would be aggressive and well-funded. Captain Martinez had already hired Commander Richard Stone, who was one of the best defense attorneys in the Space Force. Stone was known for his ability to discredit witnesses and create reasonable doubt even in cases that seemed clear-cut. Maya thanked Admiral Wright and left his office feeling both excited and terrified. She had what she wanted, but now the real work began. Over the next 3 months, Maya threw herself into trial preparation with absolute focus. She worked 16-hour days reviewing evidence and interviewing witnesses and developing her strategy. Lieutenant Kevin Morris worked alongside her, organizing documents and preparing exhibits. Together, they built a case that was airtight. Maya knew that her biggest challenge would be humanizing the victims while maintaining her own credibility. The defense would try to paint the witnesses as weak people who could not handle tough training. They would claim that Maya was pursuing a personal vendetta, so Maya had to present the evidence in a way that made the pattern of abuse undeniable, while also showing that she was motivated by justice rather than revenge. She decided to structure her case chronologically. She would start with older incidents involving Martinez and gradually build up to the recent complaints from Titan. This would demonstrate that his behavior was not just a recent problem but a career-long pattern. She would call witnesses who represented different backgrounds and experiences to show that Martinez targeted anyone who did not fit his narrow view of what a soldier should be. Maya also prepared herself emotionally for the moment when she would have to testify about her own experience. She knew it would be painful to relive that day in the processing center, but she also knew it was important. Her story showed that Martinez's behavior stretched back more than a decade. It showed that the system had failed repeatedly to address the problem, and it showed that victims could survive and thrive despite the abuse. As the trial date approached, Maya learned that the case had attracted significant attention throughout the fleet. Officers everywhere were talking about it. Some supported Maya and praised her courage. Others criticized her and claimed she was undermining military discipline. The media had picked up the story, and reporters were requesting interviews. Maya declined all media requests. She wanted the focus to be on the evidence and the witnesses, not on herself. The night before the trial, Maya stood in her quarters looking out at Earth rising over the lunar horizon. She thought about her grandmother who had taught her to braid her hair and had told her stories about fighting for civil rights in the early 21st century. Her grandmother had faced discrimination and violence, but she had never given up. Maya felt her grandmother's spirit with her, now giving her strength. She also thought about all the witnesses who had agreed to testify. Many of them were scared. Some had received threatening messages warning them not to cooperate with the prosecution, but they were doing it anyway because they believed in something bigger than themselves. Maya felt the weight of their trust. She could not let them down. The morning of the trial, Maya dressed in her formal Space Force uniform. The dark blue fabric was crisp, and her rank insignia gleamed under the lights. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She was not the scared recruit anymore. She was Commander Maya Johnson, military prosecutor. She was ready. Maya walked into the Fleet Justice Center courtroom with Kevin beside her. The room was packed with observers. Maya recognized faces from throughout the fleet, including several senior officers who rarely attended courts martial. The media section was full of journalists, and sitting in the witness gallery were many of the people she had interviewed. Marcus Freeman was there, and Jake Rodriguez and Angela White. Staff Sergeant Linda Powell sat in the front row looking determined. At the defense table sat Captain Greg Martinez, flanked by his attorneys. Commander Stone was an older man with silver hair and an expensive suit. He looked confident and relaxed, but Maya noticed that Martinez himself looked nervous. His hands were clasped tightly together on the table, and there was tension in his shoulders. When Maya entered the room, Martinez looked up and their eyes met across the courtroom. Maya saw the exact moment when recognition hit him. His face went pale as he realized who she was. He remembered that day in the processing center. He remembered the young recruit he had humiliated, and now that recruit was standing before him as his prosecutor. Fear flickered across his face before he managed to hide it behind a mask of anger. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Captain Helen Morrison entered. She was a stern woman in her 50s with a reputation for running tight courtrooms and tolerating no nonsense. She took her seat and reviewed her notes briefly. Then she looked up and announced that the court-martial of Captain Greg Martinez was now in session. Judge Morrison asked if both sides were ready to proceed. Commander Stone stood and said the defense was ready. Maya stood and said the prosecution was ready. The judge then asked Maya to present her opening statement. Maya gathered her notes even though she had memorized every word. She walked to the center of the courtroom and faced the panel of 5 senior officers who would decide the case. Maya began speaking, and her voice was clear and strong. She told the panel that this case was about a fundamental betrayal of trust. She explained that Captain Martinez had been given the responsibility of training future defenders of humanity, but instead he had abused that trust. She outlined the evidence they would see over the coming weeks. She described the pattern of discrimination and harassment that stretched across more than a decade. She promised that the evidence would be overwhelming and undeniable. As Maya spoke, she felt years of preparation coming together. Every word was chosen carefully. Every argument was supported by evidence. She told the panel about recruits who had been targeted because of their race. She described equipment that had been tampered with. She explained how the system had failed repeatedly to stop Martinez because he was protected by a network of corrupt officers, and she promised that justice would finally be served. When Maya finished her opening statement, the courtroom was silent. She returned to her seat, and Commander Stone rose for the defense. He was smooth and confident as he spoke. He claimed that Maya was conducting a personal vendetta. He said Martinez was just a tough instructor who maintained high standards. He suggested that the prosecution was confusing difficult training with abuse. He told the panel that the evidence would show Martinez was innocent of all charges. But Maya noticed something as Stone spoke. Several panel members were watching Martinez rather than listening to his attorney. They were studying his face and his body language. And what they saw was not an innocent man, but someone who looked guilty and afraid. That was a good sign. After opening statements, Judge Morrison announced that testimony would begin the following day. Court was adjourned and people began filing out. Maya stayed seated for a moment, organizing her materials. When she finally stood and turned toward the exit, she found herself face to face with Captain Martinez. The courtroom had mostly cleared, and the second day of the trial began with Maya calling her first witness. Staff Sergeant Linda Powell walked to the witness stand with her back straight and her uniform perfect. She was sworn in and took her seat. Maya approached her and asked Linda to state her name and rank for the record. Linda did so in a clear voice that showed no fear. Then Maya asked how long Linda had served in the Space Force. Linda said she had served for 20 years and had been stationed at 7 different facilities across human space. Maya asked Linda to describe her time serving under Captain Martinez's command at the Titan training facility. Linda took a deep breath and began to speak. She said she had arrived at Titan 2 years ago expecting a normal assignment. But within the first week, she realized something was wrong. Captain Martinez ran the facility like his own personal kingdom. He showed obvious favoritism to certain officers while targeting others. He seemed to take special pleasure in making life difficult for recruits who were not white males. Linda described specific incidents she had witnessed. She talked about a young black woman named Recruit Sophie Turner who had scored in the top 10% on all her entrance exams. Captain Martinez assigned Sophie to the most dangerous training exercises repeatedly. He criticized her constantly, even when her performance was flawless. He made comments about how people like her were only accepted because of diversity quotas. Eventually, Sophie quit the Space Force entirely, even though she had dreamed of serving since childhood. Then Linda talked about recruit Carlos Mendez, who came from a poor family in the outer colonies. Carlos worked harder than anyone else at the facility. He volunteered for extra duties and studied late into the night, but Captain Martinez seemed determined to break him. During one training exercise in the harsh Titan environment, Martinez assigned Carlos faulty heating equipment. The temperatures outside dropped to -200 degrees. Carlos nearly froze to death before another instructor noticed the equipment malfunction and brought him inside. Maya asked Linda if she had reported these incidents. Linda said yes. She had filed multiple formal complaints with the Inspector General's office. She had spoken to senior officers at Fleet Command. She had documented everything in detailed reports, but nothing ever happened. Her complaints were dismissed as personality conflicts. One superior officer told her she was being too sensitive. Another suggested she did not understand modern training methods. Eventually, Linda realized that the system was not going to help. So she started keeping her own records and waiting for someone who would actually care. Commander Stone cross-examined Linda aggressively. He suggested she was a disgruntled employee who had failed to advance in her career. He pointed out that she had received negative performance reviews during her time at Titan. Linda remained calm and explained that those negative reviews only started after she began filing complaints. Before that, her evaluations had been excellent. She pulled out copies of her old reviews and showed them to the panel. The difference was obvious and damning. Stone tried a different approach. He asked if training at Titan was supposed to be easy. Linda said no. He asked if some recruits washed out because they could not handle the physical and mental demands. Linda said yes. Stone suggested that maybe Captain Martinez was just maintaining high standards. Linda looked directly at the panel and said there was a difference between high standards and deliberate cruelty. High standards applied equally to everyone. What Martinez did was target specific people based on their race and gender and background. That was not training. That was abuse. Maya's next witness was Corporal Jake Rodriguez. Jake was nervous as he took the stand, but he answered Maya's questions clearly. He described how Captain Martinez had mocked his Hispanic heritage from the first day of training. Martinez made jokes about lazy immigrants and questioned whether Jake really belonged in the Space Force. During physical training, Martinez assigned Jake tasks that were literally impossible to complete and then punished him for failing. Jake's confidence was systematically destroyed over months of constant harassment. Jake told the panel about one incident that still haunted him. During a zero-gravity combat exercise, Martinez had given Jake instructions that contradicted his training. When Jake followed Martinez's orders, the exercise went wrong. Martinez then blamed Jake for the failure and held him up as an example of incompetence in front of the entire training unit. Jake said he felt humiliated and worthless. He seriously considered quitting even though military service was his lifelong dream. What saved Jake was finding other recruits who were going through similar experiences. They supported each other and helped each other survive. But several of them did quit. Good people who could have been excellent officers left the Space Force because they could not endure Martinez's constant abuse. Jake said he stayed partly out of stubbornness and partly because he hoped that someday someone would hold Martinez accountable. Commander Stone tried to portray Jake as someone who simply could not handle criticism. He asked if military training was supposed to be comfortable. Jake said no. Stone asked if instructors were supposed to be nice and friendly. Jake said no. But then Jake added something that clearly resonated with the panel. He said that every other instructor he had worked with pushed him hard, but also showed respect. They criticized his performance but not his heritage. They demanded excellence, but did not deliberately set him up for failure. Only Martinez combined high demands with personal attacks and discriminatory behavior. The third day of testimony featured Private Angela White. Angela was a small woman with fierce eyes who had served for 3 years before leaving the military. She described experiencing sexual harassment disguised as training at the Titan facility. Captain Martinez and some of his officers made inappropriate comments about her body. They suggested she had only been accepted into the Space Force because men wanted to look at her. During physical training, they assigned her to positions where her body would be most exposed. They made crude jokes that everyone could hear. Angela said she tried to ignore it at first. She thought if she just focused on her work and proved her competence, the harassment would stop. But it only got worse. One day during a training exercise, Captain Martinez made a comment so explicit and degrading that Angela filed an official complaint. Within a week, her equipment began malfunctioning during exercises. Her performance reviews suddenly became negative. Even though nothing about her work had changed, she was assigned to the worst duties at the worst times. It was clear she was being punished for speaking up. Maya asked Angela why she eventually left the Space Force. Angela's voice cracked slightly. As she answered, she said she loved serving and protecting humanity. She was good at her job and proud of her service. But the constant harassment wore her down. She stopped sleeping well. She felt anxious all the time. Her health was suffering. Finally, she realized she had to choose between her dream career and her mental health. It was one of the hardest decisions she ever made. She left the military and now worked as a civilian technician. She said not a day went by that she did not regret having to give up her dream because men like Martinez could not treat her with basic respect. Commander Stone's cross-examination of Angela was particularly harsh. He suggested she was making false accusations because she was bitter about washing out. Angela looked at him with controlled anger and said she did not wash out. She left. There was a difference. Stone asked why, if the harassment was so bad, she had not reported it immediately. Angela explained that she did report it and was punished for it. Stone implied she was exaggerating normal military banter. Angela's voice rose slightly as she said there was nothing normal about officers making sexual comments about subordinates. The panel members looked uncomfortable, and Stone quickly moved on. The most powerful testimony came from Marcus Freeman. Marcus was the young man who had nearly died when his oxygen system failed during a spacewalk training exercise. He took the stand and described that terrifying experience in detail. He had checked his equipment multiple times before the exercise just as he had been trained. Everything seemed fine when he started, but 15 minutes into the spacewalk, his oxygen alarm went off. The gauge showed his oxygen dropping rapidly. Marcus said he radioed for permission to return to the airlock immediately, but Captain Martinez told him to stay out and complete the exercise. Martinez said Marcus was probably just reading the gauge wrong. He said Marcus needed to learn to stay calm under pressure. Marcus protested that the alarm was clearly showing a real malfunction. Martinez ordered him to continue the exercise. For 10 more minutes, Marcus floated in space, watching his oxygen gauge drop lower and lower. By the time he was finally allowed to return, his oxygen was at 3%. He blacked out in the airlock. Medical personnel told him later that he had been minutes away from death. Maya introduced equipment logs showing that Captain Martinez had accessed Marcus's oxygen system the night before the exercise. Martinez had signed into the equipment locker and specifically accessed the gear Marcus would be using. The defense claimed it was routine maintenance, but Maya pointed out that Martinez was not a maintenance technician. His job was command and training. 2 weeks later, the courtroom convened again for sentencing. Maya had submitted her recommendations to Judge Morrison. She recommended dishonorable discharge and forfeiture of all military benefits, and 5 years in military prison. She had also recommended that Captain Martinez be permanently barred from holding any position of authority over military personnel. Similar sentences were recommended for Commander Kyle Bennett and Lieutenant Commander Danny Cooper, who had been tried separately in expedited proceedings after Martinez's conviction. The courtroom was even more crowded for sentencing than it had been during the trial. Every seat was filled and people stood along the back wall. Maya recognized faces from throughout the fleet, including several admirals who rarely attended such proceedings. The media section was packed with journalists from across human space. This case had become a symbol of something larger than just one corrupt officer. It represented a reckoning with systemic problems that had been ignored for too long. Judge Morrison entered and the room fell silent. She had spent the last 2 weeks reviewing pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. Now she would decide what punishment Captain Martinez would face. Martinez stood as ordered. He looked smaller somehow than he had during the trial. The confidence and arrogance that had defined him were gone. He was just a man in a military uniform waiting to learn his fate. Judge Morrison began by addressing the severity of the crimes. She said that Captain Martinez had been entrusted with one of the most important responsibilities in the Space Force: training the next generation of defenders. Instead of honoring that trust, he had abused it in the most fundamental way. He had targeted vulnerable people based on their race and gender and background. He had created an environment of fear and humiliation. He had deliberately endangered lives. And he had done all of this while protected by a network of officers who valued loyalty over justice. The judge said she had read dozens of victim impact statements. She had heard from people whose dreams were destroyed by Martinez's abuse. She had learned about careers ended, and confidence shattered and lives permanently altered. The harm Martinez had caused extended far beyond the specific charges he had been convicted of. Every recruit he drove away was a loss to the Space Force and to humanity's defense. Judge Morrison announced her sentence. Captain Greg Martinez was dishonorably discharged from the United Earth Space Force effective immediately. All rank and privileges were stripped. All pay and benefits, including his military pension, were forfeited. He was sentenced to 7 years confinement in a military correctional facility. This was even harsher than Maya had recommended, and the judge added one more element. Upon release, Martinez would be permanently barred from any employment involving authority over others in any military or civilian capacity. Similar sentences were handed down to Kyle Bennett and Danny Cooper. All 3 men were led away in handcuffs to begin their prison terms. As Martinez passed Maya's table, he did not look at her. He stared straight ahead with his face blank. Maya watched him go and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that it was finally over. Satisfaction that justice had been served. But also sadness that it had taken so long and that so many people had suffered. After the sentencing, Maya stood outside the courthouse surrounded by journalists asking for statements. She kept her comments brief and professional. She said the verdict and sentence sent a clear message that discrimination and abuse would not be tolerated in the Space Force. She hoped this would encourage other victims to come forward. She hoped it would remind all officers that their oaths required them to uphold the highest standards of conduct. Then she politely declined further questions and left. That evening, Maya sat alone in her quarters. She pulled up an old video file she had kept for 10 years. It was just a few seconds long. Her younger self staring into a mirror with tears in her eyes and a freshly shaved head covered in small cuts, that frightened recruit whispering a promise to remember. Maya watched the video and then closed the file. She had kept her promise. She had remembered everything, and she had transformed that memory into something powerful, A message arrived on her console. It was from Admiral Susan Parker, who was now the commander of fleet operations. Maya opened it and read carefully. The admiral congratulated her on the successful prosecution. She said Maya had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and moral courage the Space Force needed. Then came the important part. Maya was being promoted to captain effective immediately, and she was being offered command of the UES Resolution, a destroyer-class vessel, currently on frontier patrol. Maya read the message twice to make sure she understood correctly. From humiliated recruit to captain, with her own command. It had taken 10 years of hard work and sacrifice and determination. But she had proven them all wrong. Every officer who said she did not belong. Every person who suggested she was too soft or too weak. She had not just survived, she had excelled, and now she would command a starship. Over the next few days, Maya received hundreds of messages from officers across the fleet. Many were people she had never met. They shared their own stories of discrimination and abuse. They thanked her for having the courage to take on Captain Martinez. Some said they had been thinking about leaving the military, but now they had hope that things could actually change. Maya read every message carefully. She responded to as many as she could. Each one reminded her why this fight had been necessary. One message stood out from all the others. It came from Marcus Freeman, the young man who had nearly died during the training exercise. He wrote that he had been planning to resign from the Space Force after what happened. He did not think anyone would care about what Martinez had done. But Maya had cared. She had fought for him and for all the others, and because of her courage, Marcus was going to stay in the military. He was going to work hard and become the kind of officer Maya was. He said he would never forget what she had done. Maya sat back in her chair after reading Marcus's message. This was why she had waited so long to bring charges. This was why she had endured years of preparation and documentation. Not for personal revenge, but for this. For the possibility that her fight might make things better for those who came after. She thought about her grandmother who had fought in the civil rights struggles of the early 21st century. Her grandmother had faced violence and hatred, but never gave up. Maya felt connected to that long history of people who refused to accept injustice. A few weeks later, Captain Maya Johnson stood on the bridge of the UES Resolution. She wore the uniform of a starship commander, and her crew stood at their stations, ready to serve. The crew was diverse, representing every corner of human space. Different races and genders and backgrounds all working together. This was what the Space Force was supposed to be. This was what she had fought to protect. Lieutenant Kevin Morris served as her executive officer. He had requested transfer to serve with Maya, and she had gladly accepted. Kevin called the crew to attention and announced that the captain was on the bridge. Maya walked to the command chair and looked out at the view screen, showing the stars. She gave her first order as captain, set course for the frontier zone, standard patrol route. The Resolution began accelerating away from Luna. Maya stood at her station, watching Earth and the moon fall, away behind them. Somewhere back on Luna in that courthouse, her case had set a precedent. It would not eliminate discrimination overnight. Nothing ever did. Real change took time and constant effort. But it was a start. It was proof that the system could work if good people were willing to fight. Maya touched her scalp, which she now kept shaved by choice. It was no longer a symbol of humiliation. It was a reminder of where she had come from and how far she had traveled. Every morning, when she looked in the mirror, she saw not a victim but a survivor. Not someone broken by abuse, but someone strengthened by overcoming it. Out in the frontier zones were hostile aliens and pirates and countless unknown dangers. But Maya was ready for all of them. She had spent 10 years preparing for challenges much harder than combat. She had learned that the most dangerous enemies were not always the ones you could see in space. Sometimes they were the ones hiding inside your own organization, pretending to be allies. But she had also learned that justice was possible if you were willing to work for it, that victims could become victors, that the system, while flawed, could be changed by people who refused to give up. Maya had transformed herself from a powerless recruit into a starship captain and a champion of justice, and she was just getting started. The resolution jumped to faster than light speed, and the stars stretched into long lines of light. Maya sat in her command chair, surrounded by her crew. She thought about all the people who had supported her journey: Lisa Chen, who had been her friend in basic training, Commander Patricia Hayes, who had mentored her, Admiral Susan Parker, who had given her opportunities, and all the witnesses who had trusted her with their painful stories. She thought about the future recruits who would join the Space Force. Some of them would be like her, young people from difficult backgrounds with dreams of serving humanity. And now maybe they would have a slightly better chance. Maybe they would face less discrimination because of what she had accomplished. By the end of the second week of testimony, Maya had presented evidence from more than 30 witnesses. Each story was different, but together they formed an undeniable pattern of discrimination and abuse. The courtroom had been packed every day, with officers who wanted to see justice served and journalists who recognized this as a historic case. Maya felt the weight of all those expectations, but she also felt confident. The evidence spoke for itself. But Maya knew the most difficult part was still ahead. She had to testify about her own experience. She had been avoiding this moment throughout the trial preparation. Reliving that day in the processing center would be painful, but it was necessary. Her story showed that Martinez's behavior was not new. It showed the system had been failing for more than a decade, and it showed that victims could survive and eventually hold their abusers accountable. Maya called herself to the witness stand with Kevin Morris questioning her. This was unusual, but Judge Morrison had allowed it, because Maya's personal experience was relevant to establishing the long pattern of behavior. Maya was sworn in and took her seat. She looked out at the crowded courtroom and saw Marcus and Jake and Angela and Linda and so many others watching her with hope in their eyes. She took a deep breath and began. Kevin asked Maya to describe her first day as a recruit 10 years ago. Maya's voice was steady as she talked about arriving at the orbital processing station full of excitement and dreams. She described walking into the processing room where Officer Greg Martinez was waiting. She talked about sitting in the chair for her mandatory head shave. Then her voice grew quieter as she described what happened next. Maya told the court how Martinez had pressed the clippers too hard against her scalp, how officers Kyle Bennett and Danny Cooper had entered the room and begun mocking her. She repeated their words as best she could remember. They had questioned whether someone like her belonged in the Space Force. They had made racist comments about her hair. They had suggested she would wash out within a week. They had laughed while deliberately cutting her scalp with the clippers. Maya described looking at herself in the mirror afterward, seeing the cuts on her scalp, seeing her beautiful braids scattered on the floor, feeling humiliated and powerless. She told the court about the promise she made to herself. In that moment, she would remember everything, and someday she would make sure they paid for what they did. Kevin asked why she had not reported the incident at the time. Maya explained that she was just a recruit with no power or credibility. Reporting Martinez would have only made her training worse, so she endured it and waited. Commander Stone's cross-examination was brutal, as Maya knew it would be. He accused her of pursuing a personal vendetta. He suggested she had held a grudge for 10 years and was now abusing her position as a prosecutor. He asked if she could really be objective about a case involving someone who had personally wronged her. Maya remained calm. She told Stone that justice was not about being nice to people who hurt you. Justice was about holding people accountable when they violated their oaths and abused their power. Stone asked why Maya had waited 10 years if Martinez's behavior was so terrible. Maya explained that she waited because She wanted to build an airtight case. She wanted to gather enough evidence that the truth would be undeniable. She wanted to be in a position where her voice would be heard and respected. She said if she had brought charges as a recruit, they would have been dismissed, but now, as a commander and experienced prosecutor, she could make charges stick. Stone suggested this proved she was motivated by revenge rather than justice. Maya looked directly at the panel and said revenge would have been attacking Martinez personally. Justice was using the legal system to hold him accountable for years of systematic abuse. The most dramatic moment came when Stone asked Maya if she hated Captain Martinez. Maya paused for a long moment. Then she said no. She did not hate him. Hate was too simple and too personal. What she felt was disappointment that an officer of the Space Force had betrayed his oath. She felt anger that the system had protected him for so long. She felt determination to make sure he could never hurt anyone else. But hate, no. This was not about personal feelings. This was about right and wrong. After Maya's testimony, the prosecution rested its case. Commander Stone then presented the defense. He called character, witnesses who testified that Martinez was a dedicated officer who cared about training excellence. He brought in military psychologists who talked about the importance of tough training in preparing people for combat. He argued that everything Martinez did was within the bounds of acceptable military instruction. But his witnesses seemed weak compared to the overwhelming evidence Maya had presented. The defense's strategy became clear during Stone's closing argument. He acknowledged that Martinez's training methods were harsh. He admitted that Martinez had high standards that some people could not meet, but he argued this was not illegal. He said the military was not supposed to be comfortable or easy. He claimed Maya was trying to impose civilian standards of political correctness on a military institution that needed tough leaders. Stone's argument was passionate, but Maya noticed the panel members were not responding well. They looked skeptical when Stone suggested that racist comments were just part of tough training. They frowned when he implied that equipment tampering was acceptable if it taught valuable lessons. Maya felt her confidence growing. She had built a case so strong that even a skilled defense attorney could not overcome it. Maya's closing argument was the culmination of 10 years of preparation. She stood before the panel and spoke with quiet intensity. She said this case was about the fundamental difference between tough training and abuse. Tough training pushed people to become their best selves. Abuse broke people down based on who they were rather than what they did. Tough training was hard, but fair. Abuse was targeted and discriminatory. Maya reminded the panel of all the evidence they had heard 30 witnesses describing similar patterns of behavior. Equipment logs showing deliberate tampering, audio recordings of racist and sexist comments, medical reports documenting injuries from training accidents that should never have happened. She asked the panel to consider what kind of Space Force they wanted. Did they want an organization that valued merit and honor? Or did they want one that tolerated officers who abused their power? She talked about the recruits who had quit because of Martinez's abuse, good people who could have been excellent officers, people who wanted to serve humanity but could not endure the constant discrimination and harassment. Every one of those lost officers made the Space Force weaker. Every time the system protected someone like Martinez, it undermined the very mission they all had sworn to uphold. Maya's voice grew stronger as she approached the end of her argument. She said, Captain Martinez had forgotten that his oath was to serve all of humanity. Not just the parts that looked like him or thought like him, all of humanity. And in forgetting that he had betrayed everything the Space Force stood for, she asked the panel to send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated, that the days of protecting corrupt officers were over, that the Space Force would finally live up to its ideals. When Maya finished speaking, the courtroom was silent. She returned to her seat and waited. Judge Morrison instructed the panel that they would deliberate and return with a verdict. Court was adjourned and everyone filed out. Maya felt exhausted, but also strangely calm. She had done everything she could. The rest was up to the panel. 3. Deliberations took 3 days. Maya spent that time in her office, unable to focus on anything else. Kevin brought her updates when he had them. The panel had requested to review specific evidence. They were taking their time and being thorough. Maya knew this could be good or bad. A quick acquittal would have been terrible. But long deliberations meant they were seriously considering the evidence. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the call finally came. The panel had reached a verdict. Maya and Kevin rushed to the courtroom, which filled quickly. The tension was palpable as everyone waited. Judge Morrison entered and took her seat. Then the panel filed in. Maya tried to read their faces, but they were carefully neutral. I judge. Morrison asked if the panel had reached a verdict. Colonel James Chen, who was the panel president, said yes, they had. Martinez was ordered to stand. He rose slowly, flanked by his attorneys. For the first time since the trial began, his arrogance had completely disappeared. He looked like a man who knew he was facing judgment. Colonel Chen began reading the verdicts. On the charge of abuse of authority, guilty. On the charge of discrimination, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. On the charge of sexual harassment, guilty. Count after count, the word guilty rang through the courtroom. Maya sat perfectly still, but inside she felt something breaking open. 10 years of carrying this burden. 10 years of anger and determination. And finally, justice. When all the verdicts had been read, Judge Morrison announced that sentencing would be conducted in 2 weeks. Captain Martinez was remanded to custody. Military police moved forward to take him away. As they put handcuffs on his wrists, Martinez looked across the courtroom at Maya. Their eyes met one final time. Maya saw defeat and bitterness in his face.